Snake was right. Again, the question tonight we're debating is evolution evil, and TRock would say yes. Taylor would say no. So, TRock, we're going to give you the floor whenever you're ready. You've
okay, Donnie, I will be sharing my screen.
Absolutely.
Okay. Looks like we're
good.
up.
Looks good.
Okay. Always my personal pet peeve and friendly reminder, especially to those that call themselves believers: thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. If evolutionists use good arguments, they would be creationists, because the evolution theory itself is just an untenable position to hold. Okay, so tonight we're talking about evolution. Is it evil? What is the definition of evil? That's probably a key point in this debate. I don't normally care about definitions of words, just because I assume people know how to communicate in context, but I do find it necessary sometimes. And so here, the biblical definition of evil, and this is an inferred definition. You can read lots and lots of scripture, and the point of the Bible is not to explicitly define the word evil. Nevertheless, the inferred definition is that which tears down or destroys. And so the Oxford definition is profoundly immoral or wicked. And there are some distinct differences, very important differences between these two definitions. The biblical definition actually encompasses things like physical destruction. So if a whirlwind, for example, or a tornado comes through and destroys your house, that is considered evil by reason of it destroys something that was useful. And it doesn't actually go to the extent to provide this type of, what's the word I'm looking for? In the Oxford definition, profoundly, that word is a qualifier. And so what you see in the Oxford definition of evil here is a high degree of subjectivity. Who decides what level constitutes profound? Who decides what is immoral? Who decides what's wicked? It's extremely ambiguous, actually. Whereas the biblical definition, as you read the Bible, you can start pinpointing very specifically what constitutes evil, what constitutes that which tears down or destroys. Okay, so definition of evolution. The simple definition is change over time. This definition in and of itself is entirely inadequate, because everybody believes that things change over time. This is kind of in that crossover region of what evolution and special creation have in common. The biological definition is, and this comes from a website called ScienceDirect.com, the change in inherited traits over successive generations in populations of organisms. This is also inadequate, because this is actually some of that same type of crossover. It's more specifically referring, of course, to biology and living organisms. But even the creationist believes that traits are inherited from previous generations. But the implied definition, that's the important part. It's the universal common ancestry of bioorganisms, from ancient simple forms to present-day advanced organisms, including but not limited to plants, mammals, reptiles, fish, etc. And so that's, when we're talking about evolution, this is actually what I personally am referring to. So I'm referring to an alternate history to the biblical history. Okay, what is actually being debated? The implied meaning of evolution, universal common ancestry, and whether the teaching of it as factual Earth history is inherently evil. And of course, that is my position, that it is inherently evil. Okay, what is evolutionary biology predicated on? Is it predicated on the scientific method? Does the scientific method stand on its own merit, or is it underpinned by a philosophy or a way of thinking? The scientific method is actually underpinned by naturalism. Does evolution have a moral code? Most would probably say no. But that's no different than whether rocks have a moral code. They clearly don't. But to teach or not to teach is a moral question. So how does naturalism or evolution decide whether to teach or not to teach biological evolution? And furthermore, how does it decide whether teaching it is evil or not? In order to answer that question, a moral position must be assumed. But what moral position, and how is anyone to know whether that position is good or bad? And so evolution is left without an absolute moral reference frame from which to evaluate the goodness or evilness of a particular teaching, hence moral relativism. So what is moral relativism? Go back and look at the secular definition of evil. It actually incorporated the word immoral. But how do you know what's immoral if you don't know what's moral? So moral relativism basically is you get to decide. You get to decide what you think is right and wrong. You get to decide what is good and bad. You get to decide what is beneficial to society or not. So then is teaching evolution objectively evil or immoral? Okay, so to answer that, what impact has evolution had on science, and what impact has evolution had on society? So I didn't dig real deep here. I don't think it's altogether necessary. I think we all understand the positions well enough. But the impact of evolution on science has been that they have touted things like vestigial structures, particularly in humans, is the context here. The appendix, tailbone, wisdom teeth, tonsils. Now, we can say for sure that the appendix, wisdom teeth, and tonsils have all been surgically removed, specifically because people thought they provided nothing of any great importance to human health. We found out after the fact, unfortunately, that is not the case. The appendix harbors beneficial bacteria that aids in digestion and a number of other things. Wisdom teeth are actually a mechanical necessity for chewing. They do cause problems when they go wrong, but the fact that something goes wrong does not indicate that conceptually it isn't a good thing to do. And tonsils, you don't have to go any further than your local dentist to find out about tonsils and why nowadays they no longer recommend tonsillectomy, particularly in children. There are some issues. I'm not going to discuss all that right now, but tonsils used to be considered somewhat vestigial and not necessary. As it turns out, they are necessary, and there are downhill consequences for performing things like tonsillectomy. Junk DNA, we all know about junk DNA. Basically, this is where science overlooked some very important research in favor of the idea that it was just evolutionary leftovers that didn't do anything. Since then, many geneticists and microbiologists have dug a little bit deeper and figured out that it's not near as much junk as they originally supposed. So it has absolutely hindered scientific progress to take an evolutionary path in your thought process. And chasing aliens, I threw that in there because, ultimately scanning the universe, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it has been a big waste of time. It has yielded absolutely zero results. The energy could have been much better used doing legitimate medical research and other types of things, energy efficiency, that sort of thing. Nazi concentration camps. We're going to talk a little bit about Hitler, of course. You can't hardly have these conversations without talking about the Holocaust. What a lot of people may not realize, though, is that the Nazi concentration camps were actually somewhat of a scientific research endeavor by the Nazis. They literally brought people in and dissected body parts off of living people and basically just completely abused their existence in the name of scientific research. Absolutely horrendous. Have fundamental principles of evolution that are unique to evolution produced any scientific advancements? Absolutely not. The two big things that actually distinguish evolution from special creation are deep time and a fundamental change of body plans from one type of organism to another over such deep time. Neither of those concepts have any relevance whatsoever to modern science, and so evolution is nothing but a deterrent from otherwise good science. You might find some irony in the fact that even the evolutionists, when they go to do biology, medical research, that sort of thing, they're looking for results now, not 100,000 years from now. Personally, I find that hugely ironic. They're actually pursuing more of a creationist approach in their results. Okay, so here's the big one. What's the impact of evolution on society? I've got several quotes here to kind of underline how evolutionary thinking should impact the world, and this kind of goes back to the sources. So Darwin, of course, lived in the mid 1800s, and the Holocaust and all that, and several other very large scale wars and genocides happened during the early and mid 1900s, following the teaching of following the explosion of the popularity of evolution. I'll say the famous evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould could write that the sin of racism, for instance, increased by orders of magnitude due to Darwin's work being used as justification. Anti-racist Darwinists, including Gould, howl with indignation that this was a misuse of Darwinism. I've underscored that word misuse. The single quotes around it were actually in the original, and the article there is listed, so you can go look that up. But misuse, how do you misuse something that has no inherent moral underpinning? Who decides whether it was used properly or improperly? Because evolutionary theory on its own does not provide that type of moral guidance. If it did, it would probably be considered, even in the public spectrum, a religion. Another one, this is from Carl Weiland. Thus, given a large enough group of people who share a Darwinian worldview, one will overall see more immoral behavior, even atrocities. The 20th century of Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot made this clear. There were indeed atrocities and wrongful wars in the name of religion before then, but many more people were killed, most by their own governments, in the name of evolution-inspired ideologies than all the wars of recorded history put together, religious or otherwise. Impact of evolution on society. Hitler and the Nazi Party claimed that one of their major goals was to apply this accepted science to society, i.e. social Darwinism. And the core idea of Darwinism was not evolution, but selection. Evolution describes the results of selection. That was, Hitler stressed that to produce a better society, we, the Nazis, must understand and cooperate with science. In their political system, with nothing left out, their political dictionary was replete with words like space, struggle, selection, and extinction. The syllogism for their logic was clearly stated: the world is a jungle in which different nations struggle for space. The stronger win, the weaker die or are killed. This is very akin to the old terminology, survival of the fittest. That's where those words typically come from, survival of the fittest. That phrase was sort of phased out of evolutionary vocabulary because the implications were literally as brutal as the Holocaust. In the 1933 Nuremberg Party rally, Hitler proclaimed that higher race subjects to itself a lower race, a right which we see in nature and which can be regarded as the sole conceivable right because it was founded on science. And this was from an article by Jerry Bergman in creation.com, Darwinism and the Nazi Race Holocaust. This is another article quote. And Hickman adds that it is no coincidence that Hitler was a firm believer and preacher of evolution. Whatever the deeper, profound complexities of his psychosis, it is certain that the concept of struggle was important because his book Mein Kampf clearly set forth a number of evolutionary ideas, particularly those emphasizing struggle, survival of the fittest, and the extermination of the weak to produce a better society. So you can go check that out as well. Excellent article and very, very comprehensive with all of the extant quotes that you would possibly need to support that position. And then there's Margaret Sanger, the eugenics of Margaret Sanger. Sanger believed she was working in accord with the universal law of evolution. As Sanger stressed in a talk given at the Fifth International Neo...
1 minute.
Thank you. As Sanger stressed in a talk given at the Fifth International Neo-Malthusian and Birth Control Conference, the end goal of her movement was to produce a superior race. Today, the average reliance of civilization is based upon iron and steel, bricks and mortar, and we must change this to the construction and evolution of humanity itself. I will stop there and pick up later on in the discussion.
All right, thank you. There we go. Thank you, TRock. That was 14 minutes. So we'll give Snake equal time. Snake, you can use up to 14 minutes. As always, whatever time is not used in the openings and rebuttals, we will toss into the open discussion. I do want to remind the audience, you can start tagging me with some questions. I did see a couple come in, and so I'm all caught up on them. Just make sure you're tagging me for the audience Q&A. So, Taylor, we're going to hand it over to you. You got up to 14 minutes whenever you're ready. Go ahead.
All right. So science is not good or evil. A gun can be used for good or for bad. So I challenge you to think about this, that being good or bad does not make something any less true. Challenging evolution on its morality is kind of a trick that some people like Kent Hovind try a lot. The Dharma is our most dangerous religion, but this criticism doesn't really make any sense in terms of trying to disprove it, but I'll address the criticisms regardless. So the universe is deadly. Things die. Things go wrong. Evolution is dependent upon death as a filter. One of the filters. There are other filters. Okay. But how is this a criticism of the scientific consensus? That's not. It's just a factual description of what life does. So I guess the criticism now becomes that adopting the principles of evolution somehow leads to bad morals. And by far the only people who challenge evolutionary science are religious fundamentalists. They take a literalist view of biblical or Quranic texts, which ironically comes along with a lot of moral baggage, like slavery and eternal damnation for thought crime, genocide commanded by God, etc. So we can compare these two worldviews, so to speak, for lack of a better term, because evolution isn't actually a worldview. I don't know why we would expect it to have any moral announcements at all. It's just a science. We don't expect chemistry to say anything about morality. We don't expect physics to say about anything about morality. We don't expect engineering to say anything about morality. So the fact that evolution lacks any moral principles is in line with all of these other scientific theories that are not considered to be evil by and large, other than anarcho-primitivists. Evolution is just a view of natural history, but in fact does not inform literally anything else about how one should live their lives, how they should look at the world morally or philosophically, otherwise, just like any science. There's no normative function of evolution, so this criticism doesn't make sense either. It does not tell one what one should do. It only describes what happens to life and how it affects populations. Okay, but some people don't like the implications of human beings being animals or the idea of survival of the fittest, even though these are also ideas in creationist evolution. There's still survival of the fittest. Why doesn't this count towards inspiring brutal tyrants who use similar terminology to sound profound? What about the accusation that belief in evolution is an excuse to sin without consequence, maybe? So let me put your minds at ease. If humans are evolved, we are still the same beings as in religious theology. We are thinking, loving, curious, social beings with value. We're valuable in our own rights, whether or not there's a God. If God If there's a God and he loves us for what we are. And what we are doesn't change whether there's a God or not. Just as we value our many animals or our pets, would your pets have any less value if there was no God? No, we love them for what they are, regardless of their origin or where they came from. But I repeat myself. As for the excuse to sin, if I wanted to sin without consequence, I'd be a Christian. Christianity's God is not only immoral, but its judgment system is amoral in that we are not judged on sin or virtue or morality. We are judged solely on whether we think a particular version of a particular God is real or not. And all of our sins are erased if we happen to get lucky enough to pick the right God from among all the other gods who rely on faith alone to justify belief in them. And the idea that natural selection leads people to things like eugenics on humans, it's just complete rubbish. Creationism requires mass death and natural selection as well. And yet, for some reason, we're not, all of these same characteristics are present in the literalist biblical narrative. They still believe that animals went through natural selection. They just don't believe that there is a common ancestry for all that life. So this distinction makes no moral difference. It's absolute nonsense to lay the claim on common ancestry evolution when creationism has all of these exact same properties that TRock listed, as some people mention. The use of scientific sounding terminology is what all snake oil salesmen do. But as we'll see, they don't actually portray evolution correctly. They're just using the terms to sound like they're using science, which is evil. Yes, misrepresenting science, just like flat earthers use terms like magnetism. But we don't say that physics and the study of electromagnetism is evil just because flat earthers use those words. The fact is that genocide, racism, slavery, and tyranny reigned long before evolutionary theory and actually have only started to go away in the modern era with evolutionary theory. I'm not claiming a cause there. These things, slavery, racism, genocide, they're not justified by evolution. But it is literally enshrined in scriptures as justified by Almighty God. He commands genocides, he commands, or he allows slavery at least. He commands slaves to, the Bible commands slaves to be obedient to their masters. So no regime committing any of these crimes has ever cited actual scientific evolution as their guiding principle. They've cited God, they've cited other ideologies, and they've cited science sounding terminology to sound like they know what they're talking about. But when we actually look at their quotes, they're actually misrepresenting the scientific concepts. The Nazi regime of eugenics were a Christian dictatorship. Hitler praised God often. And we can read off some quotes from Hitler. He was a creationist. Even the godless communists were still religious fundamentalists who rejected Darwinian evolution a la Lysenkoism, starving millions. It's no wonder. Capitalism has deep roots in evolutionary law. Free market competition follows many of the fundamental laws of biological evolution, yet leftists accept evolution and reject capitalism, while fundamentalists, let's face it, most are right-wingers, reject evolution but accept capitalism, even though they're essentially the same thing. The Christian worldview is closest to the Soviet regime that would stick people in gulags for having the wrong beliefs, except worse. At least gulags end. And closer to the National Socialist German Workers' Party in terms of apologism for slavery and genocide than any Academy of Evolutionary Biology has ever been. The entire Nazi concept of eugenics is pseudoscience anyway, as I said. They're just using terms to sound like they're scientific, but they're really not. The regimes that TRock brought up it's not evolution that's causing this impact. They are all socialist regimes. That is the problem. Socialism is what's causing all this mass death and evil. So, in fact, evolutionary biology teaches us about population fitness, not genocide. Evolutionary biology has revealed that individuals do not have to necessarily compete or kill off weaker individuals to increase the fitness of the population. They can cooperate with weaker individuals. Many species have evolved and naturally do help weaker members of their society because it benefits them. And that also works on the population level because different species cooperate as well. The entire concept of racial science from the Nazis is scientifically bunk and utterly refuted by simple biology. So they're misusing scientific terms, scientific sounding terms, anyway. Denying evolution has gotten millions of people killed by the worst regimes on the planet, and has contributed to a gross misunderstanding of science itself at best. Denying evolution is exclusively the result of ideological conflict, usually the biblical or Quranic worldviews, or socialist. Now, you might say, if it's the communists who denied evolution, what does that have to do with religion? Well, socialism is a religion. It's a secular religion, but a religion nonetheless. It's a pseudoscience with answers to all of man's sins. Socialism is intelligent design. Social Darwinism is not evolutionary biology. It's intelligent design. Socialism is also wrong, which is why if any hypothesis is derived from this false ideology, this hypothesis will fail. They start with their conclusion, and their ideology permeates everything else. So when they see competition in nature, like in capitalism, they lose their minds and try to control everything. And this will eventually fail because it's false. It's a false worldview. Same with creationism. It starts with the conclusion and makes the facts fit it, and thus they fail with everything else concerning science, where it conflicts with their unfounded presupposition. Like creationists, no amount of evidence will convince the ideological socialists. It's held against reason. And all evidence to the contrary, such as the fact that TRock said it's untenable, but the fact that almost all scientists, like 99.7% of scientists, even higher in the biology, deem evolution as very rigorous. And so things like this are then called malicious conspiracies by the elites against the truth, just as the socialists claim. So is evolution itself an evil idea? No, it's just a physical reality. Truth is just truth. Does belief in evolution naturally lead to evil actions informed by said views? Well, if you believe something that's true, how can we say that that is necessarily evil unless the universe itself is evil? I'm not contending that. But in fact, the most evil institutions of the 20th century and 19th century rejected evolution rather explicitly, and the mass murders they committed were motivated by ideologies that explicitly rejected both atheism in many cases, and definitely the true scientific misunderstandings of evolution and anatomy and biology and race, and competitive nature. The fact is, we can't actually morally complain about a natural law like evolution. It just is. Only if a God designed and intended it can we complain, as it is now the result of an intelligent and thus morally culpable agent. So we can complain about the things presented in the Bible, which apparently is the only alternative to evolution. But what's more evil? A system where animals live and die, admittedly sometimes harsh lives, or a system where all of that is still true under the creationist model, but this God also intentionally, cruelly drowned and crushed nearly all lineages of life.
1 minute.
As well as nearly all of the individual members of the species he did spare, as well as millions of men, women, and children, just because he got mad at the way he made them. which contains more moral issues, which contains more problems for the theist. And I suspect my opponent will soon say that I have no way to complain morally without a God, but this is playing into my hands, as theists have no way to describe good or evil without borrowing from secularism. We'll discuss, but to sum it up, you can't even know if your God is a good God unless you have an independent theory of good and a way to judge your God morally in the first place. And this is important because you can't just take a God's word to be good without a way to test that God's goodness. How would you know if he's lying, or if it's the devil pretending to be God but offering evil really, but using nice words, using scientific words? You can't, not with your method of faith. So no matter what, one must first take on my theory of goodness in order to have any leg to stand on. And I think we're coming up on the time limit, so we'll see you in the rebuttal.
All right, Snake, that concludes the opening statements. Gentlemen, you both got about 14 minutes and lots of interesting points and topics to discuss for the rest of the debate. So we're now moving into the 8-minute uninterrupted rebuttal. TRock, I am going to hand the floor over to you, and whenever you're ready, you've got 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen again.
Okay, you're good.
Okay, so the general thesis of evolution is not evil, as presented by Taylor, was that evolution is simply a historic view and does not actually propose a morality at all. But essentially, that is the problem. What it's doing is supplanting biblical history with a different history. And there is a particular reason for doing such things. And because it's self-professed not a moral code at all, that is exactly why it leads to moral relativism, which, not ironically, Taylor mentioned early on in his introduction that he was going to start some sort of program pursuing some ideology along those lines. I don't remember his exact wording. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but nonetheless, that's kind of the gist of what he was proposing as a program that he was going to start up. But the absence of a moral code, does that inherently mean that it can't be evil and can't be good? Absolutely not. There's implications that come out of the teaching of evolution. If it were true, number one, it would be irrelevant whether one believed it or not. There's no consequences for not believing in evolution. People have functioned in society for thousands of years just fine without believing in it. And that will continue to be the case. It is completely irrelevant if it were true. Morality is at the discretion of each individual organism. Again, this is the implication of evolution being true. It's not a teaching of evolution per se, but it is the logical consequence of evolution being true. It would be that morality is always at the discretion of each individual organism, i.e., moral relativism. Being dead is no more right or wrong, good or evil than being alive. This is naturalism 101. Things explode, things come and go, animals die, animals live. It's just part of the process. None of it's relevant to anything. Evolution is responsible for the rise of religion if evolution is true. If evolution is true, we're here because we evolved from chemicals self-assembling in a warm pond somewhere, or in a warm ocean vent or something to that effect, and we're essentially the descendants of lower animals, and we just somehow evolved higher brain capacity and so on and so forth, and religion is just one of those consequences that came out of it. So if evolution is true, it's responsible for the rise of the religion that Taylor was complaining about. Ideologies of the past are no more right or wrong than ideologies of the present or the future, because they are all just byproducts of evolution. That is the logical consequence of evolution being true. It's, again, moral relativism. How do you know people from the 1800s were wrong? How do you know people from the 1600s were wrong? How do you know the Taliban is wrong? They've got a different sense of, they've got a different moral code than the average American does, evolutionist or otherwise. How do you know anybody's right or wrong? There are literally thousands of different moral codes, if not tens of thousands or even millions of moral codes in the world today. Everybody's got their own sense if evolution is true. And therefore, nobody can decide which one is right or wrong. Everybody has to decide for himself or herself. And the other big thing that, the other big thesis that I think Taylor tried to point to is is that there's some sort of conspiracy going on, but there is no conspiracy. This is a quote from Aldous Huxley. He was the grandson of one of Darwin's disciples. He said, I had motive for not wanting the world to have a meaning, consequently assumed that it had none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. The philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with a problem in pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do, moral relativism, or why his friends should not seize political power and govern in the way that they find most advantageous to themselves. For myself, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation, sexual and political. I don't probably have a whole lot of time, so I may not get to all of these, but let me see if I can get through this one page. A religion is essentially an attitude to the world as a whole. Thus, evolution, for example, may prove as powerful a principle to coordinate men's beliefs and hopes as God was in the past. Such ideas underlie the various forms of rationalism, the ethical movement, and scientific humanism. That was from Sir Julian Huxley, again, moral relativism. In the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer either need or room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. So did all the animals and the plants that inhabited it, including our human selves, mind and soul, as well as brain and body. So did religion. That was Sir Julian Huxley. Brother of Aldous Huxley, by the way. If we don't irritate, which I fear that we may, though mere history, we shall carry all with us. If you don't triumph over them, but compliment the liberality and candor of the present age, the bishops and enlightened saints will join us in despising both the ancient and modern physico-theologians. It is just the time to strike, so rejoice that, sinner as you are, the QR is open to you. P.S. I conceived the idea 5 or 6 years ago that if ever the Mosaic geology could be set down without giving offense, it would be in an historical sketch, and you must abstract mine in order to have as little to say as possible yourself. Let them feel it and point the moral. That was Charles Lyell. So it's not a conspiracy. It's what they declared they were trying to do. Conclusions. Evolutionary thinking, naturalism, provides the framework to allow for moral relativism. So really the question now becomes, why is moral relativism evil? In moral relativism, we make the rules, and therefore all rules are valid across all times and places, which essentially means that there are no rules. If there are no rules, then any one act cannot be right or wrong, good or evil. But having no rules leads inexorably to confusion, chaos, and destruction, because no one can agree on what is morally detrimental or beneficial. And so that's the end of that slide. But in closing on my rebuttal, I want to point out that it's a major philosophical blunder to say that evolution provides no sense of morality in one direction or the other, because it's simply a historic view. It's a major philosophical blunder, because evolution has to be underpinned by a way of thinking, and a way of thinking has to be underpinned by a sense for whether that way of thinking is right or wrong. And so it is inescapable that evolution denies a biblical history with a firm, how I like to say, absolute moral reference frame, and supplants it with a false history and no moral framework, as professed by individuals like Taylor. But there is no such thing as no moral framework. You have to have a
10
sense
seconds.
what's right or what's wrong. And I will close.
Okay, TRock, thank you so much for that 8-minute rebuttal. Taylor, we're now going to hand it over to you for your 8-minute rebuttal, and I will let everybody know in the audience I am all caught up on questions. I appreciate your questions, and as always, it looks like we'll have a solid audience Q&A. So, Taylor, over to you. 8 minutes. Whenever you're ready, floor is yours.
Okay, so I regret to inform you that I am not a moral relativist. So you just spent a lot of time arguing with someone who is not me. You might be happy to hear that I will accept your definition of evil, although I would amend that evil I would use it to mean something more intentional, contrasting that with like a natural evil, which I would prefer to call just bad or badness. But I think we can largely agree that bad or evil does tear down and destroy. I think essentially good boils down to existence and coexistence. Again, I'm not a moral relativist, and I didn't make up these definitions. I think that they're the English definitions of these words. I am a moral realist, and I believe that morality is objective, and that is why I have such a issue with the subjective morality of particularly Quranic or biblical worldviews, which rely on the subject of God and not objective moral facts. However, I am encouraged that you actually did provide a definition for evil, which I can agree with. Perhaps we can work on that foundation, because I believe God would have actual justifications beyond "I said so," right? So, yeah, evolution doesn't have a moral code, just like collecting stamps does not have a moral code, just like chemistry doesn't have a moral code. Just because evolution doesn't have a moral framework doesn't mean I can't have a moral framework. Evolution has nothing to do with my moral framework, yet they exist alongside one another. Just like my having a driver's license does not have a moral framework. Again, these things are completely irrelevant. Like what do you expect it to do? No science has a moral reference frame, and evolution is just a part of science. You might say that it's wrong as a science, that it's a failure of evidence. I don't see how this leads to moral nihilism or moral relativity, as no science has a moral framework. Even sciences that were wrong in the past do not have moral frameworks. Yeah. So I believe in evolution and moral realism. God is moral relativism, though, as explained. Let's so trying to go through some points here. Yeah, evolution just doesn't comment on morality. So to address some of your points, well, I guess I'll end that section with evolution doesn't comment on morality, and it doesn't prevent a biblical moral code either, as most Christians believe evolution just fine. As for some of your points, I'd like to address vestigial structures. This displays a misunderstanding of the topic. Vestigial structures are not claimed by evolution to be totally useless structures, nor has there been any harm specifically from evolution on that. If we don't know the function of it, it's not really informed by evolution. But on the contrary, evolution would define these structures as structures that no longer have their ancestral function. That does not mean that they no longer have a function at all, and that you can find that definition in the textbooks and dictionaries. As for junk DNA, this concept has not really been overturned. I believe what you're probably referring to is the ENCODE project, which redefines the term function, biological function. Normally, when that term is used, biological function would be referring to a gene that translates into a protein. What the ENCODE project said was if it has any biochemical activity at all, then it counts as function, which means if it bonds with H2O, anything like that, it's counted as having a function, which is not a biological survival function. So these are two very different terms. I would like to keep everyone away from equivocating those terms. That's a fallacy. As for chasing aliens, I have no idea what this has to do with anything. I guess we're not supposed to be spending money on space exploration in too creative a way. But I think things like cancer are given more funding, and evolution actually helps with that. So yeah, that goes to another point you made about your question of whether evolution has produced any scientific advancements. You say no. Perhaps you're unaware of how protein modeling is used. Evolution is used for that. Evolution is used to predict all kinds of things with genetic research. AIDS research, it led us to not only understand what it's doing, but understand its behavior. Epidemiology in general is tracked with evolutionary principles. Genetic engineering and genetic medical diagnoses and technology. AI learning uses evolutionary principles. We're able to find fossils using evolutionary principles that in precise locations and predict their forms, etc., etc., etc. There are so many applications of this that I'm not even mentioning. These are just off the top of my head. As for the sin of racism used for evolution, actually, I addressed this earlier. These are the societies he's talking about were socialist societies, not evolutionist societies. And I've talked about scientific sounding words that they used. They're just snake oil salesmen. Flat earthers don't speak for physics just because they use terms like buoyancy. Your question of how do we know if people are right and wrong? Do we wait around for a God to tell us? No, this isn't reliable. First off, how do we tell which God and whether that God is correct, or whether the people telling us about this God are correct? But this is easy to do. Slavery is self-contradictory. It's illogical and thus cannot be corrected by any meaning. It also reduces existence and coexistence and destroys and tears down. And so this is why it's important to look at the Bible, as it cannot be true because it has self-contradictory moral codes and is based on the subjective will of God. If I've got time, I would like to address a quote from Adolf Hitler that might launch us into his discussion. The fox remains always a fox. The goose remains always a goose, and the tiger will retain the character of a tiger. Where do we acquire the right to believe that the man has not always been what he is now? The study of nature teaches us that in the animal kingdom, just as much as in the vegetable kingdom, variations have occurred. They've occurred within the species, but none of these variations has an importance comparable with which separates man from the monkey. That is from Adolf Hitler. And that reminds me of a certain Mr. Hovind.
All right. That concludes the opening statements, which we had about 15 minutes, 14 to 15 minutes for, and the rebuttals, 8-minute rebuttal. So again, lots of good points and topics to discuss during this 40-minute discussion period. As the discussion's going on, I will be doing my best to save all the questions. I am up to date currently in terms of the audience Q&A. So what we'll do, since Snake was right, just ended with his 8-minute rebuttal, let's hand it over to you, TRock, and you can help us lead the way in terms of the discussion. If there is a point you wanted to start with, questions, so on and so forth. So gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Okay, so you answered one of my questions, I think. I think you said you were satisfied with my definition of evil.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I take it you also accept the Oxford definition.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so a couple of the definitions that I personally was not satisfied with from you, and I'll get you to say exactly what you think. It's just the context in which you used the words. What is faith?
Faith is belief in something that which you have evidence for, complete trust, specifically in a god or doctrine of religion. Belief based on spiritual reasons rather than proof.
Belief based on spiritual reasons rather than proof. Okay. Now, are you using the modern definition of the word faith, or do you recognize a biblical definition of the word faith?
Well, I use the modern English definition, as that is the language we speak.
So,
But it's to my understanding, it's exactly the same as in the Bible. What is the quote? It's faith is belief in the hope for things unseen.
actually, it is not exactly the same. It's actually very different than the definition of faith in the Bible. The quote I believe you're looking for is, now faith is the evidence of things. How's that go? Faith is the evidence of things hoped for. Is the substance. Sorry, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So it is substance, and substance is, by definition, things that are tangible in the physical realm, and it is evidence, i.e., evident. It is evident, and to put a little better point on what biblical faith is, in my own words, faith is actually basically the process of hearing somebody who is in the position to know, believing that person, and acting accordingly. Which, ironically, or maybe not ironically, is exactly what you have to do when you go through the educational process to get a PhD in evolutionary biology or any other discipline for that matter. You have to listen to the person who's in the authority to know. You have to believe what they say, and you have to act accordingly. That is biblical faith. So, simple question: who was in the position to know the origin of the world? Darwin? No, he wasn't there. Any PhD scientists you know of? No, none of them were there. The God of the Bible, Jesus Christ, is in the position? No, because he is the creator of the world. So our definition of faith is we're getting firsthand information from somebody who was there.
There's one problem with that is you don't know whether any of the people professing on behalf of your God are someone you can trust. You don't know whether
Actually, we do.
Academics can actually put up evidence. No prophet can actually demonstrate what they know. And depending on the translation, you can get confidence in what we hope for, assurance about what we do not see. But it's much more interesting because of the point that I brought up earlier is you really don't have any ability to test who you're trusting in the biblical sense. You can do that with academics, you can do that with sciences, but you can't do that with any prophets. And if you claim you can, you're going to get the same result for all of them, no matter the religion.
Actually, the opposite is true. You can absolutely have confidence in prophets. You can absolutely have confidence in who the creator is. You cannot have confidence in the historic rendering of scientific data. It's an interpretation only. It's a non-eyewitness interpretation. It's changed over the years. Every time they turn around, they change pieces of the story. Now, is the general framework more or less still there, that lots of time happened in universal common ancestry? Sure. But so many pieces of the puzzle have changed because it is just an interpretation. How do you ever know when you're actually right about any of that? All you got to do is wait for the next piece. All you got to do is wait for the next piece of data, and somebody's going to overturn it and come up with a new idea and overturn what you thought you knew for fact in the past.
That's really easy. So if you can predict certain things about, I don't know, what's wrong with the engine. If you hear a certain sound and you go, oh, the carburetor is busted, and you go in and in fact the carburetor is busted, that means that that person understands what they're talking about. So in the sciences, if we can go, we know how life changed, therefore there should be this type of animal in this type of rock, and we go and find it there, and when it was never found before, if that particular method is the only way that we found that, that's good evidence that we know what we're talking about. Contrasted with prophets, none of these prophets were there when the world began. All they do is claim something and then just claim that the God told them that it's real, and there's nothing else we can do except just trust them.
I don't think I'll spend a whole lot of time defending the Bible, since that's not actually the topic of the debate, but I will briefly say that your rendering of what a prophet is entirely non-biblical. It has no, it's just completely untrue. If you actually read the Bible, you can tell what prophets actually do. The Bible actually gives you a way to know whether a prophet is from God or not, and prophets frequently performed miracles openly in the public in front of everybody so that they would know they were from God, because normal men who just go around telling lies and making up stories could not do those things. Nevertheless, I'm not here to defend biblical theology.
So in
I'm
what
here
way
to
am I
determine
wrong?
whether, about what?
Are you saying that I'm wrong because prophets perform miracles?
I'm saying you're
Because
wrong because you literally claimed that they can just make up statements and nobody knows whether
they
they're
can.
telling the truth or not. And I'm telling you, no, that's not true. There is an actual biblical prescription on how to determine false prophets from real prophets, and miracles and prophecy, both of those together help common people like ourselves that aren't prophets know whether they are from God or not. If a person was literally making things up, like you alluded to, they would not be able to tell the future or perform miracles that are impossible with ordinary men.
So the Hare Krishnas tell me the same thing. The Muslims tell me the same thing. So because a prophet claims that an older prophet did a miracle, that's good enough for you? Even though there are modern prophets where millions of Hindus claim that they saw the miracle. Is that good enough for you?
As I've already pointed out, I'm not really here to defend biblical creation. I'm here to demonstrate that evolution is evil by virtue of not having a moral code, and basically being a false flag in pretending that there is no moral implication of following evolutionary teaching.
All right, so we'll go on to that topic. So you're claiming that because evolution does not have a moral framework, that entails moral relativism?
So it has to, because you can't have a way to think about your data. You can't have a way to think about your method. You can't have a way to think about anything without underpinning it with some type of philosophy. And your philosophy has to be underpinned by some sense of what's right or wrong. So
not for science.
In other words,
Philosophy of science. The philosophy that underpins science is testing. It doesn't have anything to do with morality.
But how do you test, and what do you test, and why do you test?
Anything. It's the scientific method. So chemistry also does not have a moral framework. If I'm a chemist, does that entail that I'm also a moral relativist?
That's not what I said. You're talking about and I pointed this out very clearly in my presentation. In and of itself, to explore the world is not a position that induces moral relativism. The reason evolution induces this particularly is because it presents a false history, and it has to have a way of thinking whether that's right or wrong. That's very different than real-time scientific endeavor with real-time observation. But even those things, when you're doing chemistry, it doesn't imply, when you're doing lab chemistry, it does not imply that you are a moral relativist, but you cannot do chemistry without a moral underpinning, period. That no human action can be done without a moral underpinning. Not one.
Okay, that's pretty insane. So there's a woman on TikTok who claims Rome did not exist. That's presenting a false history. Does that mean that she's necessarily making a moral relativist claim?
No, that's not. That is an
Okay, so
example.
we've knocked
That's an
out.
example of moral relativism. She's deciding whether it's right or wrong that somebody recorded accurate history. So it's an example.
That's not. How is that moral relativism? That's not morality. That's a claim about history. Whether Rome existed as a cohesive state or not is not a moral claim.
It doesn't. Like I said, every single action a person does has to be underpinned by morality. So her decision to decide that Rome does not exist is underpinned by the idea that she thinks somebody lied about it.
Okay, so we're knocking out that variable that it's based on a false history. So now we're talking about every action needs a moral underpinning.
Yes.
Explain that. Why do amoral things need a moral underpinning? Why do I need a moral underpinning to draw a picture of a tree?
Because they're always, and this is the thing about evolution. This is the thing that evolution denies, is that there are consequences to your actions. So to draw a tree, that's a really simplistic deal. Exactly. What did you draw? Why did you draw it? Who did you draw it for? What are you using it for? Is it idle time? What is it? It's something. It's not nothing.
It has nothing to do with morality. If I decide
yes, it actually does.
If I decide I want my tree to be red, how is that a moral question?
It's not a moral question in the direct sense. Am I doing right or wrong in that sense? But it has a moral underpinning, because somebody has to decide whether it is a waste of time to draw. Somebody has to decide whether there's a benefit in drawing. Somebody has to decide, is there a message behind the drawing? It has tons and tons of moral implications. So the moral underpinning is there, whether or not you perceive it and whether or not it's beneficial or harmful. That's kind of a different thing. But everything has a moral underpinning.
If I'm understanding you right, you're saying that everything has a moral underpinning because I could be using that time to be doing something better or worse?
In a sense, yes, that's true. Or perhaps you're doing it because there's a message you're trying to convey.
How does evolution deny consequences? Because as I understand it, evolution is almost exclusively about consequences of genetics.
No, it's not. Evolution is, by and large, as I pointed out, one of the telling questions that I pointed out is, and I think you tried to work around this, but I don't think you effectively did. Name me some technology that has been produced based on ideas that are unique to evolution and deep time.
Archaeology.
That's not you. No, archaeology is not unique to biological evolution of common ancestry or deep time, either one.
No, I meant to say paleontology. Sorry. Yeah, a lot of paleontology is based on evolution.
But what technology has it developed that specifically requires the major tenets, which are deep time and universal common ancestry?
The technology is the method. It doesn't have to produce like a computer program.
So
the technology, in a sense, is it could even be me writing down on a piece of paper. I know that the birds are in these layers and the dinosaurs are in these layers. Paper is a technology. It doesn't have to be that much of a technology. The technology is in the method of saying, if these are connected, then there's going to be an in-between phase.
So you're talking much more about predictions than you are technology. I'm asking what technology has ever been derived.
That's still a technology.
That's not a technology. Furthermore, let me go on and clarify something about that. Even if you thought you could somehow convince people that that's technology when it's not, even if you thought you could, the problem is that creationists can also go out there and find the exact same things using completely different thought process.
They can't.
Yes, they can.
No, they can't, because they didn't and they never have. Every single one, every single novel, you can go out and find another Archaeopteryx, but guess what found the first one? It was always evolutionary process. Same with all of the other transitional forms. Were all discovered using evolutionary processes. There is no creationist who went, I predict that there will be a Tiktaalik because for no random reason I just predict it. No, the only reason it was predicted is because of its features and its location. And that's also the way it was found, is because it was predicted in that location.
You're talking about somebody had an evolutionary assumption, went out, dug a hole, found what they were looking for, and then voila, that's technology. It's
That's
not
how science
technology.
works.
But my big point here is that anybody who just randomly dug a hole could have found the same thing. And a creationist who assumes a global flood can use different thinking, whether they have or not.
Nope.
In the specific example of Archaeopteryx is irrelevant. But
Nope. Where's the example?
An example is by biblical definition, if the world was fully flooded 4,400 years ago, and it was, we should find marine fossils all over the world, and we do.
Yeah, but that's not a novel prediction.
And furthermore,
everyone expects there to be marine fossils. So, and no, what you said about anyone randomly digging a hole can find it. No, people randomly dig holes all the time. These specific fossils were found where they were because they dug in a certain area, because they knew where they would be.
So,
and they knew what would be there. So it's like when you know where the gold and the diamonds are, and you go to where they are and you find them, and you don't find another mineral, that means you understand something about gold and diamonds and how they form.
The problem there is that evolutionary theory is built on the assumption of common ancestry, and it's described by nested hierarchies in phylogeny. So what you're looking for is is basically an ecological zone where you see similarities between physical structures in the organisms, but creation specifically requires such things because in special creation, it's a design feature. So I can logically say, hey, if there's something with webbed feet, it should be very close to something without webbed feet, but still has feet. And so, in other words, it's not really unique to evolutionary theory to be able to put these basic physical characteristics together and then go find something. They're buried by ecological zonation in large part. And so as a creationist, in understanding good design principles, I understand that things live on land, near water, in the water, underwater. So there's a progression across there. And locomotion, for example, is highly dependent on your ecology. So I can use creation principles and find things in the fossil record the same way.
Name one that's been found that way.
I already told you the entire planet covered in fossils.
You don't get to just say all the fossils. So there are no specific examples that were found specifically using creation principles.
I personally do not have an example, no.
And no, ecological zonation doesn't work because there's no pattern to that. There's no zones. Yeah, there's no reliable pattern to that. And so there are marine zones in up and down throughout the whole fossil record. There's beach zones, there's forest zones up and down in most of the layers. And there's no reason for a creationist to assume a form that they don't already have knowledge of. So there's no reason for a creationist to think that there's going to be a half dinosaur, half bird form, whether it's specially created or not. They have no reason to predict that. Evolution does have a reason to predict that. That's why it's found.
So people have been on the planet for a long time, and people have seen pretty much every form of living creature imaginable. So nothing about animal forms is unique to evolution or the
Almost all of the known body plans are not living today. So no, most people have not seen the vast majority of living animals.
Actually, the evolutionists say the opposite. They say that most of the major body plans were in existence since the Cambrian.
Referring to like things with spinal columns or tetrapods, but the variety of that's being very vague. So yeah, there were tetrapods, there were four-legged animals, but did anyone see a Spinosaurus? Did any living
Yes,
human? No, and
yes.
that's a completely different debate. But you can
Well, I mean,
provide
this whole line
absolutely
of
no evidence of
evolutionary,
that, other than drawings of dragons. That's the best I've ever seen, which
this
look
whole
nothing
line of
like any
evolutionary
fossil
investigation
dinosaurs.
is actually a different debate. What we're really here
Yeah.
talking about is evolution inherently evil? And I'm still saying yes, it's evil because it can't provide a moral framework, but the
Yeah,
moral framework has to exist anyway. And furthermore, it deliberately, as I demonstrated in my quotations that I provided in my presentation, it deliberately undermines the one absolute moral reference frame that does exist.
so you don't have an absolute moral reference frame. You have a God who you trust for some reason is right. Um, but no, just because a particular science, whether it's mostly right or mostly wrong, just doesn't have a moral framework, doesn't mean that that person can't have a moral framework. So I can believe all these sciences, they don't have moral frameworks. They don't have moral frameworks. You might need a moral framework to exist to decide what to do with your time. We can run with that. That doesn't affect my argument at all. But you don't need it from evolution. You don't need to have that in evolution. It's a separate thing. I have a moral framework. I have an objective, moral realist framework. It has nothing to do with any of the sciences. It's just logic. I guess if
No,
you consider logic a science, but
you kind of gave it away a little while ago, just a second ago, when you said you said it doesn't mean you can't have a moral framework. That's the whole point.
yeah.
You can have one. You have to have one. And when you teach evolution, you have to have a way to discern whether or not what you're teaching is true or false, and whether it's right or wrong. The scientific method can't prescribe to you whether or not you should investigate fossils. That's not what it does. There is a philosophical view that does that for you. And then there is a moral view that tells you whether you should or shouldn't.
Okay, and what does that have to do with evolution? I can have a philosophy of whether I should or shouldn't do whatever, and it has nothing to do with what I think is true using the scientific method.
So, for the audience sake, so that we can get a good visual image of exactly why this is true, what I'm saying is you think of it like a typical building foundation. Evolution is not the foundation; it's the building sitting on the foundation, and everything has to have a foundation of both a way of thinking and a sense of morality, i.e., what's right or wrong. Should I do this or should I not? And so that's where the teaching of evolution is wholly inadequate to pretend it's some kind of standalone robotic factology kind of approach. It's not. Somebody has to decide why it is that they've gone down this path. And
But you're not distinguishing it from any other science at this point.
yes,
So
I am. I'm saying all sciences have to do this. Evolution.
okay, so what is special about evolution? Because
Evolution.
I can have that foundation. I can just have a
Evolution
foundation
is
without it being part of any science.
evolution in particular suffers because it deliberately undermines a true world history and an absolute moral reference frame. You said I don't have one. You said the Bible is a subjective or is morally relative, not absolute. And herein lies the difference between evolutionary thinking and biblical thinking. We have the Bible preserved and we don't change what it says. It stays the same throughout all ages. Whereas in evolutionary thinking, you can change the history, you can change why you do something or why you shouldn't do something. Anything and everything is subject to change. And so by definition, it is a relative position, not an absolute position. And by definition, the biblical position is absolute, not relative, because it does not change.
You can have a biblical foundation and have evolution. You can have a different foundation and have
That's
evolution. It doesn't matter. So now you've shifted it. So you said it undermines the foundation because it's based on a false history. So now you've shifted the goalpost back to evolution, true or false, since you said it's wrong, it's bad because it undermines a true reference frame, true moral reference frame, or I think you said true historical reference frame or something.
A true history and an absolute moral reference frame. And
so that's shifting it back to, is evolution true or false?
And the answer is false. Therefore,
it's clearly not false.
By the biblical, and you made a theological claim a little while ago. You said it was irrelevant because you can be a Christian and an evolutionist, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
That's much more of a theological position than it is a philosophical or scientific position.
So, show me how it's false that you can have a Christian moral foundation and have evolution on top of that.
You can't. That's just it. You cannot have biblical creation as a foundation and set evolution on top of it. It doesn't work.
So biblical creation is the only form of Christian? Only biblical creation Christians are going to be saved?
That is another theological point that I'm not really here to discuss, but I will.
But that is that's the linchpin of what you're saying.
No, it's not. And the reason it's not, again, it's purely theological. That's why we don't need to actually go down this trail.
So you're running away from every time I tie down what is the linchpin of your argument, you run away from that and move on to a different one.
No, what I'm trying to explain to you, I'm going to answer your question for you real quick. The reason it's not relevant what you ask about being saved or unsaved is because, theologically speaking, judgment belongs to God, not individuals here on earth. It's not our position to determine those things. So how am I supposed to answer it? By biblical standards, I can't.
Your claim is that evolution destroys a moral foundation.
It does.
Right?
Yes.
Except you can still have your Christian moral foundation with evolution.
No, you can't.
How is that true?
Because, so I'm going to kind of go back to the nuts and bolts of why it is that evolution does not fit with biblical creation. And it's because it does supplant the history given in Genesis of the creation of the world. Now,
I didn't say biblical creation. I said Christian.
Okay. But I'm telling you why it is that they don't go together, why it is not the moral equivalent to be let's say what do they call them? Evolutionary creationist or a young earth creationist. They're not actually morally equivalent. Now, again, I'll leave it up to God to decide who's saved and who's not saved, but by biblical standards, they're not morally equivalent. And the reason is because evolutionary teaching in general eradicates the Genesis history, replaces it with a completely different history. And in so doing, what happens is you read the very plain language of Genesis, and it says God said this, God did this, and gives a very historical point-by-point explanation of how we came to be. And when you teach people to not read it in that context, what you're doing is you're telling them, oh, by the way, it's also okay to go over there and read thou shalt not kill and put a different spin on that too while you're at it. And so it leads to absurdity, and it's a self-defeating position. You want more theological reasons why they're not morally equivalent. It's because the Bible says that except you become as a little child, you shall in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, if I read the Genesis account to a little child, they're going to conclude that God created the earth in 6 literal days. And but taking the evolutionary approach to undermining that history, all you're doing is opening up the floodgate to turn everything the Bible says into allegory, which is uber common in the Christian world.
No, because they're actually biblical scholars talk about how they can tell the difference between like poetry and metaphor and
sure they do.
just recounting actual events. And most Christians do not interpret it like that. And
sure
they haven't gone and interpreted Jesus out of the Bible for thousands of years using that same framework. And the problem go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say they do come up with these very fancy explanations, and you want more theology on why we know that they're wrong, it's because internally they're inconsistent. We can tell when somebody stands up in the name of Christianity to defend evolution and they start giving their reasons. We can just read more scripture and say, wait a minute, that doesn't align with this, and that doesn't align with this. And so the example of becoming as a little child is just one of many, many examples how we know that. Other examples include how the prophets, the biblical authors from one end to the other referred to Genesis as a literal historical event. So yeah, they have some explanations. They do some fancy weaving of ideas to try and convince people. But internally, when you read the plain text, not just Genesis, but through the entire Bible, you find out that they are internally inconsistent in doing so, and therefore they are not the moral equivalent of reading the text as it's plainly written.
I don't get that sense from the Bible, but so if you're saying that the problem with so I think that you have a problem there. So either you've got if you're saying that you can only have a biblical literalist creationist framework for anything, and evolution is in conflict with that foundation, and you haven't shown any way that that's the correct foundation, but so either you have evolution destroying the foundation, or in my estimation, you have the foundation destroying itself, because your literalist creationist framework is based on a self-contradictory subjective moral code. So which one do you want to destroy your foundation? The foundation or things built on it?
So you're doing essentially the same thing as the evolutionary creationist apologist does. You're basically making a claim about the Bible's internal inconsistency, but you're inconsistently reading the Bible in order to do so.
No, because the Bible advocates genocide and slavery, so that can't be a consistent
No,
moral
the
code.
Bible does not advocate genocide. I don't know where you got that from, but it absolutely does not advocate genocide.
It advocates that the Amalekites be killed down to the last child.
For why?
Because some Amalekites attacked the Israelites?
No, that's not it.
Yeah, the Bible says, remember what they did to you when you came out of Egypt.
Okay.
Deuteronomy 25:17. Remember what Amalek did to you, by the way, as you came forth out of Egypt.
Yeah. And so what you're talking about is an act of war, not genocide, and it was not an intent to kill out a race per se. So
okay, so Hitler's war was just an act of war, not genocide, because they were trying to eliminate every last man, woman, and child of the Jewish race, who had, some of which were claimed to have created a capitalist socialist conspiracy to crash the markets and take over the banks. So therefore, every last man, woman, and child of the Jews deserves to die. Based on what you just said, that's totally justifiable, because that's exactly what God says in the Bible to do to the Amalekites. Kill every last man, woman, and child of that tribe, because some of the members of the government sent some soldiers to stop the Israelites from invading their land, which God told the Israelites that they would do, to invade their land and take their lands.
So Hitler gave some intellectual reasoning for doing what he did, but some of that intellectual reasoning also included basically a more classical sense of genocide, in that he wanted to kill inferior races in order to elevate the Aryan race. So it was not this simple politically driven or act of war kind of thing. In other words, it wasn't a moral code that they violated that he thought he needed to retaliate for, and if it was moral relativism on his part. But he literally attacked the Jews because he thought they were genetically inferior. The case of the Amalekites, they are actually combating moral injustice. The Amalekites were extremely wicked people. They had spread disease. They had killed people at random without cause. They did all kinds of things that the Bible determines to be morally, what's the word I'm looking for, abhorrent. And
But
so
God says that the Israelites are just as wicked as the Amalekites.
and he punished them accordingly. And so
And
that
so,
it shows the absolute
that's
standard.
true.
It
That's
shows
proof
the
that's
absolute
objective
standard.
God decides these people did the same thing. You're both immoral. You both spit on God. But I'm going to treat you guys differently because I promised your ancestors that I would give you a nation. But these other guys who are just as wicked, I'm going to tell you guys to wipe out every man, woman, and child. That's a subjective moral standard. That is not an absolute standard at all.
No, what you just did was a very hasty generalization. What God actually did with the Israelites.
That there's a double standard.
No, it's not, because you failed to identify exactly what really was happening. You generalized it so much that you missed what really did happen. What really did happen was God said, nobody's above the law. He said, turn not to the right nor to the left. This is the law. This is what you do. You don't make up reasons to find legal loopholes. And he said, if you do, I will punish you accordingly. And his punishment actually included the death and dispersion of Jews, depending on exactly what the severity of the crime was. But a whole lot of Jews died. A whole lot of Israelites died because they broke the law. A whole lot of them. The ones that lived, those were the ones that God had mercy on because they did not break the law. And so he had a specific cause and a specific punishment, and he separated those that broke the law from those that did not break the law.
So you're sitting here justifying mass death of people for believing the wrong things. But evolution is the evil worldview.
What do you do with abortion? What do you do when you do an air raid on the Taliban because you don't like what they're doing? You're doing the same thing. You're making a judgment, and the Bible tells you how to make these judgments anyway.
Well, I'm against the invasion of the Middle East. So
okay,
that just makes everything worse because our military kills innocent people.
They do kill innocent people. But the Bible is very explicit in not killing people without a just cause, and that just cause is, and the Bible spells out what's punishable by death and what's not. And the Bible is very explicit on when you have legal authority to kill somebody and when you don't. You're not allowed to just go kill people for frivolous reasons.
But God does. Someone touched the ark, he killed that person.
No, that's not what. No. You're the one. You're the one inserting the idea.
Being born to an Amalekite was good enough death sentence for all the millions of children he ordered the Israelites to murder.
No, you're the one inserting.
Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 8. At Horeb, you aroused the Lord's wrath so that he was angry enough to destroy you. Okay. He also wants the Israelites to destroy the Amalekites and the Canaanites. What is the only difference? He promised the Israelites' ancestors that he would give them a nation.
That is not the only difference. You're completely conflating
any
that.
Any biblical difference?
I think yes. In one instance, you might notice that the command was given to kill everything down to the last animal, and in another case, it was not quite that extreme. And in some cases, he actually commanded them to. He actually gave a way to avoid the war altogether. He told them whenever they were going into the promised land that if the people that you come up against will make a peace treaty with you, then you're not to go to war with them. But there were specific ones that had specific crimes that carry a specific death penalty, and those are the ones that God gave them leave to make war against and kill. And so it's not frivolous at all. I might point out real quick that I think there's got to be huge irony in the fact that you're importing your own idea of moralism into the Bible to determine whether it's morally sound or not.
I am importing the idea of contradictions. That's it.
No, that's not a contradiction.
No,
You're
no
just not
contradictory
elucidating the.
statement. No contradictory statement is valid, and there are self-contradictory morals in the Bible.
No, there's not.
Um,
You just did not elucidate the cause and effect.
you didn't give me any difference between destroying one people versus destroying another. You did, however, say that it's justified for God to say, you can invade these people's lands, the Canaanites, because I promised you their lands. And if they surrender and make a peace treaty with you, you don't have to kill them. That's not moral. That's
How
the
do you know that?
self-contradictory and double and subjective moral code.
No, it's not.
It's just
There's a
based on
biblical
whatever God
principle.
wants. That's subjective.
There are two biblical principles which dictate whether that should be true or not, and one of them is mercy. So even when somebody breaks the law, you're allowed to have mercy and forgive them. Are you required by the law explicitly in some cases? No. Because the other thing that differentiates whether it's internally consistent or not is that the law specifically delineates what's punishable by death and what is not. And so, for example, laying with a
They didn't break
beast.
the law.
How do you know?
That's not why they're being invaded, at least. God says it's not because of your righteousness or integrity that you're going to take possession of this land. And it's not breaking the law. It's because he promised them a land. So is it mercy to invade a people and take their land because God supposedly promised you their land, and then say, oh, I'll be merciful. I won't murder you as long as you just submit.
That's God's land.
That's what Islam does.
No, there's a big, huge difference. Islam does not have
zero difference.
No, that's more of your moral relativism.
Islam also says that Muhammad can go make war on whatever tribe he wants. And then Muslims will make apologies and say, look, they're showing mercy because you can make a treaty with Muhammad and they won't kill you. Meanwhile, Muhammad's the one doing the invading and starting the wars, just like the Israelites.
Guys, in the last few minutes, let's just make sure we're on topic as much as possible. I know there's a lot of overlap here, so that's fine. But again, topic is evolution evil. Last few minutes, let's just make sure we're on topic as much as we can in order that we can, comprehensively address all the points brought up in the openings and rebuttals. Go ahead, gentlemen. Just a few minutes left on the discussion. Then we're going to open up. We're going to go into closings.
So...
okay, how long are the closings? Sorry.
No,
good question. 5 minutes each.
Okay. So once again, I think there's just got to be huge irony in that you're trying to dissect the morality of the Bible by importing your own sense of what's moral, and you keep saying no. It boils down to an internal conflict of ideas, and it does not, because in every case. In every case that you've described, there were legitimate moral issues in the background that were dictated by the law to determine whether or not they had the right to put somebody to death or not. But be that as it may, per Donnie's comments, the question is evolution evil? And I'm saying it is inherently evil because it has no way to determine
Right. So
it has no way to determine what's right or wrong. It relies on the individual to make that determination, which is what moral relativism is.
As I understand it, it's not that evolution has no way to determine right and wrong. It's that it conflicts with what you see as the only moral foundation to determine what's right or wrong. And of course, I'm dissecting that because you're saying that that's the part that makes evolution evil. And of course, I have to dissect your moral foundation. I have to be able to analyze the validity of any moral foundation before I start building on it.
Sure, but you should include cause and effect and not just generalize it.
When I find contradictions within that foundation, I have to use a different foundation. The foundation I would suggest lacks contradictions and is based on logic and how to get logical coexistence going.
So the big problem, of course, is you only come up with this idea of contradiction if you generalize things. When you actually nail down specifically what was going on in the historic setting, it's not at all what you described. But
well, slavery is contradictory no matter what context you put it into.
Is evolution evil?
So is genocide. There's no way to justify killing children because they were born in the wrong land.
So there is a historic backdrop behind evolution as well, and I think we probably should have actually went down this path a little more thoroughly. But so the theory of evolution was popularized by Darwin in the mid-late 1800s, and by the early 1900s, we had people like Margaret Sanger preaching eugenics and trying to force sterilization on people specifically because they were trying to control what they thought was bad lines of evolution. They were specifically driven by evolutionary thought processes. So is evolution evil? History tells us from Margaret Sanger to Pol Pot and Stalin and Mao Zedong and Hitler, every one of them had an evolutionary ideology driving their decision making, and it's not coincidence that those things happened within just a few decades after Darwinian evolution was popularized.
Well, but as I said, that has been going on throughout history. Tribes tried to eliminate other tribes for all sorts of reasons.
You're right, but go ahead.
And so if you want to start quoting people, here's a quote from I'm sure this man, Kent Hovind, is not using evolutionary principles. He says, in God's perfect law, if we would continually eliminate, execute people that do these certain crimes, we would gradually get a much better society so that not so many people have this mean gene in them. Kent Hovind. That sounds like eugenics to me. So this idea of trying to eliminate people from society that you don't like, supported by some pseudoscientific words, this has always been around, and they'll latch on to whatever science is popular at the time. That doesn't say anything about
evolution. That's exactly the point. You can throw some science out there. It has some obvious logical implications, but it has no moral underpinning. Therefore, people can do with it what they want. That's the whole point of this debate.
You can do that with religion too. You can say, my God commands that I murder your entire tribe.
No, you can't, because there are specific rules behind it, and it's an absolute set of laws, not a subjective form that I can just make it say what I want to. That's why the creation.
My God said so, so I get to.
That's your interpretation. That's not at all what the Bible says.
It is what the Bible says.
No, that's not what the Bible says.
Whosoever, Joshua 1:18, whosoever rebels against your word and does not obey it, whatever you may command them, will be put to death.
Okay.
Whatever you may command them.
Except that does not leave.
Whatever you want, as long as I say God said it.
If ever there was quote mining, that was it. If ever there was quote mining, that was it. Because Joshua had a priority to obey the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not kill. Joshua could not just summarily decide he wanted to kill somebody because he told them to go dig a ditch over yonder and they didn't do it. That's not what the law says. Joshua
so just revealed a contradiction.
No, I did not. What I revealed was
you can put people to death, but then telling him you can't kill. That's a contradiction.
What I did was differentiate between quote mining and having an underpinning that gives you strict rules on how to make that decision.
That's not quote mine. You gave the context, and the context reveals a contradiction.
That was not the whole context. That was a small piece of the context.
Feel free to give it.
I did. Joshua came up in his infancy with the 10 Commandments. The commandments are very explicit, and he also came up from his infancy with the or I'm saying infancy. He may have been a young man when they exited Egypt. But anyway, he came up with the law of Moses, and the law of Moses is very explicit. You cannot kill people for frivolous reasons. There has to be an investigation. There has to be multiple eyewitnesses. One of the laws of Moses says, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established. Joshua was not signing on to this idea. He was not given this free reign to just kill people because they disobeyed him. That's not what was happening.
Whoever rebels against your word and does not obey it, whatever you command them will be put to death.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it
With the
says.
law, with the tenets of the law. That's a big absence from your quote mining.
He can make
The
the law
law.
whatever he wants.
No, he can't. That's another
Whatever you've
major.
commanded us.
That is another major. It's a major theological blunder and a major philosophical and a major literary blunder.
That's what
He
the
could
text
not.
says.
No,
You're all
that's
about
not.
going to what the text plainly says.
And I'm telling you what the text plainly says.
Just as
Joshua
we
came up
fully
with
obeyed
the law of
Moses, so we
Moses.
will obey you.
And the law of Moses, I mentioned this earlier, the law of Moses is very explicit in that you shall not turn to the right nor to the left. You shall not make up your own rules and legal loopholes, Joshua included. And furthermore, the theology also dictates that God is not a respecter of persons. But I digress, because we're here to talk about evolution, and we keep getting off, and you keep throwing moral relativism at the Bible as if you have a standard for which to know, but you clearly don't actually understand the theology of the Bible.
But we got it onto one variable that says there's a problem with evolution because it contradicts what you claim to be the only valid moral framework. So if there's a problem with that moral framework, that's what we're looking at right now.
So again, the problem is also that evolution inherently denies having a moral foundation, and therefore inherently opens the door for moral relativism. People can literally do with it what they want because it doesn't tell them how to use it.
Nor
So
does chemistry,
if people,
nor
for
does
instance,
astrophysics, nor does painting a pretty bird.
Exactly. So you have to port the moral framework that you have into the use of that particular discipline. And so again, back to evolution and what its historical repercussions were. Do we need to pull up the pictures of Oda Benga and how people were parading him like a wild animal to make some sort of proof text for evolution being true?
So you've put the debate onto the solvency of the moral foundation. That's why we're there.
Yeah.
Time. All right, guys, I gave you an extra 15 minutes there in order to make sure that we've addressed every single point, every single topic. There isn't a lot of overlap, so I decided as moderator to be more kind of withdrawn in terms of just letting you guys direct the conversation. So, well, 55 minutes discussion, very good, very engaging. The chat's been very lively as well. And why don't we move into 5-minute concluding statements? This is where you gentlemen can, address any final points, anything left hanging. This is your opportunity as well. So 5 minutes each. TRock, we're going to start with you. My good man, whenever you're ready, you got 5 minutes. Snake, you'll get 5 minutes, and then we're going to do some audience questions. So TRock, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Okay, so once again, thank you, Donnie, for hosting us, and thank you to the audience. I'm kind of looking forward to the Q&A session, like always. I guess the topic being debated is evolution evil, and so the claim is that because it has no moral structure of its own, it cannot be immoral. In other words, it can't be evil, but by reason of not having one, it opens the door for anybody to have whichever one they see fit. So there is no such thing as a contradictory use of evolution in terms of what its implications are. What do you do with it? Why do you use it? There are none. It's already been openly admitted that there is no control for that. But as humans go, everything you do has a moral implication of some sort, however obvious or obscure it might be, it's there. And so what we want to do is look at history and see what have people done with it in history. And so the counterclaim is that they misused the science. But how do you misuse something that has no prescription on how to use it? You can't. It's impossible. It's a logical contradiction. So Anyway, on those grounds alone, you open up the door to let people make their own decisions in their own reference frame, in their own judgment. And so whether it was Hitler, with the Holocaust, or whether it's, gang warfare in the streets of Chicago, or whether it's the Jews and how they conquered the land of Canaan, evolution can't say what's right or wrong. It's already been self-admitted that it doesn't do that. That's not what it's for. But does evolution encourage that type of thinking? Absolutely. Does evolution try and erase some other moral framework? Absolutely. It tries to erase a historical framework. In other words, it basically tries to say that the moral crime is done by others who lied or made up some frivolous history and replace it with what it proposes to be a true history. And so it's actually parading as a science when it's not. It is literally just a historic guesswork, but it comes with very strong moral implications, and that is, as I've already pointed out, it's well seen in the decades following evolution. That's kind of sort of the proof text for what evolutionary ideology does to a society. Is the generations that followed kind of went rampant with war and self-justification on why they can kill and why they should let live, and which species is superior to the other, and that sort of thing. So anyway, I think it's self-evident that when you basically throw out a history that allows people to explore their own purpose for existence, moral relativism follows, and therefore chaos follows, because nobody gets to decide what's right or wrong except in their own the context of their own small world. So they can't be an absolute moral foundation. And I will close with that.
All right. Thank you for that concluding statement there. TRock, let me restart the timer, and we'll hand it over to Taylor whenever you're ready. You've got up to 5 minutes. Go ahead.
All right. So we got it down to the variable that there's no problem with evolution if there's a good moral foundation under it, and evolution does not contradict with that. So, well, let me back up for a second. I don't think that, while I think TRock's ideas are pretty bad, I don't think TRock's a bad guy. I think he's stuck defending a horrific religious text, but I really appreciate your calm demeanor. It's a good conversation. It was civil. You're a smart guy. I think you're stuck defending this text with a lot of baggage, but and that's kind of the problem. It was a good engagement on where we disagree on these things. So yeah, I ended up needing to dissect the moral foundations that you have, because what you're saying is that the goodness or badness of evolution would have to depend upon the moral foundation, and I think that your foundation is particularly weak because it is, one, subjectively based on the words of a God, and two, is self-contradictory on top of that. So if there was a God, and if that God did have good moral foundations, it would be for reasons other than because God said so. So I think those reasons are the same regardless of whether there's a God or not. I think good is existence and coexistence. Evil is the destruction of that. And so God would value those things for what they are, and a bad God would value things like slavery or genocide. And I think that's very apparent from a plain text reading of the Bible. So I think it did get a little bit confused there, because I thought we isolated the variable that evolution, the goodness of evolution depends on the moral foundation, but then he went on talking about evolution by definition also, like well, you said that I said that evolution can't be used for evil. I don't think there's a logical contradiction that evolution could not be used for evil. Guns have no moral foundation either. They can be used for evil. They can also be used for good. Any science can be used that way. Um, I don't know of any examples of evolution being used for evil. I've seen, like you said, misuses. But you asked, how can there be a misuse without a moral prescription with how to use it? Um, that's an interesting point. But what I meant is that using terms that sound like real science, but they aren't actually that science, it's misusing. Like if flat earthers are saying gravity is just buoyancy and density, that's a misuse of those terms. That has nothing to do with whether you have a moral prescription on whether you should be buoyant or not. Obviously, I do think that there is a moral prescription to do science. I think that science is good, but that's a separate issue. So misusing scientific terms is using them in the wrong fashion. I've only seen straw men of evolutionary terms be used for evil. Nothing in evolutionary biology says that certain races are morally superior or inferior to others. It only describes what traits might lend to survival. As for moral foundations, as I said, you can get a moral foundation that preserves
1
existence,
minute.
that maintains it, that increases it. You can get a moral foundation that is not self-contradictory. And so when we see positions that evolution is bad because it contradicts these positions, yet these positions are themselves morally abhorrent. They advocate for the killing of children for being born in the wrong place, or being gestated in the womb of a woman who cheated on her husband, supposedly. That's part of the Bible. God will kill the baby if the woman cheated on her husband with a curse.
10
Slavery,
seconds.
this is not tenable as a moral foundation, but you could have consistent moral foundations alongside evolution.
All right, that concludes the concluding statements. Gentlemen, thank you for a very engaging, a very interesting debate. We will be having more debates on this topic in the future. And that being said about debates, I'll go over a couple reminders real quick and give the debaters here who have been going now 2 hours nonstop. So great endurance. We'll give you a 30-second break as I go over some of these upcoming debates. So we've got a solid mix over the next month, the summer of debates. Excuse me. And we got some soteriology debates, nature of God debates, creation evolution debates. And this one's coming up. Looking forward to this one. Charles Jennings and Merritt. Many people might know him as his YouTube name's Crimson Air. So they're going to be debating 2 Peter 2:20. What is the proper exegesis? We just booked this epic debate. This one's going to be not for a couple months, but I am pumped for this one. So the Marian dogmas debate, Protestant versus Catholic. Dr. Robert Sungenis and Steve Christie from the Born Again RN YouTube channel. So they are going to be engaging this very important debate. TRock, you're going to be back here, brother, very shortly. Battle of the T's, TRock, T-Jump, creation versus evolution. I'll be debating Luca Medugno in a week or so on endogenous retroviruses. Are endogenous retroviruses evidence that humans and chimps shared a common ancestor? We've got a solid debate on hell. Turretin fan and CJ Cox, 2 seasoned debaters here. Conditional immortality versus eternal conscious torment. And Matt Slick, he'll be back here debating Stanley Terry. So they'll be debating, was Jesus fully God and fully man during his earthly ministry? I don't yet have the thumbnail, but I did just book Kent's 300th debate on August 29th. And Kent will be debating Jay Bundy. So he's a PhD, Dr. Jay Bundy. He's been trained under Richard Lenski, and he's done work on the famous Lenski experiment. So that will be that'll be the perfect debate number 300, and that'll be a good way to end the summer of all debates, especially when it comes to the Evolution Debate Challenge series. So, all right. And that's just a snapshot of the overall events we do have scheduled for the next several months. I'm already starting to book for October and November, actually, believe it or not, since there's just so much going on. As well as our Defending Genesis Conference 2022 is from September 5th to the 8th. And then on the 9th, we have an Evolution Debate Challenge debate. So we'll end that conference with also an epic debate. Okay, well, anyways, break time's over. TRock and Snake, we're going to get into these questions, and we'll just start right at the beginning, I guess. So Brandon Connell, $5 super chat. Thank you so much. So he asks to TRock, Christianity destroyed a lot in the past, which follows your definition of evil. Therefore, Christian is evil. What are your thoughts on that, TRock? Go ahead, brother.
Okay, it's going to be hard for me to predict exactly what it is that he means by destroyed. Destroyed what? And why? So in biblical Christianity, let me think about this for just a second. So there's a thing called the no Scotsman fallacy, no true Scotsman fallacy, as a somewhat formal logical fallacy. It works for a Scotsman because there's no handbook on what it takes to be a true Scotsman, but in Christianity that's not the case. So it depends on exactly what you mean by Christians destroyed. What did they destroy and why did they destroy it? People who profess Christianity and destroy things are acting contrary to what the Bible teaches. And so it's not Christianity that's doing the destroying. It's the opposite of Christianity that's doing the destroying. So I'm not sure if you've made a logical fallacy in trying to equivocate between Christians and what the Christian ideology is in the Bible, but that's what it looks like to me. Christianity, by biblical standards, is not evil. It tells you to do things like turn the other cheek, love your neighbor as yourself, and so on and so forth. So if Christians were destroying something, acting contrary to those ideas, it's not biblical Christianity that's at fault. It's the individual that's acting contrary to what his belief system teaches him.
All right, thank you. TRock, Snake, over to you if there's anything you'd like to add.
So I think that this is a good point. In Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 25, it says, the Lord said he would destroy you. So perhaps TRock might need to look at his God and definition of evil. But I will throw him a bone. I think that they're destroying destructive things is making room for freedom in life. So net, I think you can destroy bad things. However, I would say that destroying the children of the Amalekites, for example, not a good thing. And I'll say, that creative destruction can be a good thing overall, net. But in terms of what God destroys in the Bible, tends to seem like net bad. Or he's not destroying bad. He's destroying net good. So his behavior is net bad.
Okay, thank you, Taylor. TRock, question was for you. We'll give you the last word.
So Taylor did make one necessary point, and that is that when you have cancer, you cut the cancer out. You're destroying part of your own flesh to do so, but in the end, it's for the greater good. So you're destroying evil so that good can flourish, essentially. Other than that, what Taylor did was equivocate again between Old Testament law and New Testament liberty from the law. Modern day Christians are not told to go kill anybody, and the ones in the Old Testament that were told to kill anybody were not told to do so for frivolous reasons. There are specific crimes delineated in the law of Moses. Prior to any of those wars, the law was given so that they would know how to make the proper judgment, and that proper judgment was destroy people for very specific immoral acts, not just any random act that they didn't like.
Okay, appreciate it. Next question comes in from Red Paint Spray. Thank you so much for your question. Question for Snake. Does evolution assert that humans evolved? Therefore, we are still evolving? Question mark. If so, does that mean some races are less advanced genetically than others? Go ahead, Snake.
So I think that's a yes, yes, and no. So evolution asserts humans evolved. We are still evolving, the populations. But no, that does not mean some races are less advanced genetically than others. We're all surviving just fine. And it doesn't act like, okay, so the Africans evolved and then the white people evolved and the Africans stopped evolving. Technically, we are an offshoot of the Africans, but they are still evolving as well. Same with apes. They're still evolving. They evolved into chimpanzees. We evolved into humans. A chimpanzee is going to be a whole of a lot more genetically advanced than a human out in the wild. So it's really not about an objective, absolute sense of genetic fitness. The fitness is all about what environment you're in. Some of the most fit animals were destroyed by a comet, and so they outcompeted the smaller animals before, but then the smaller animals survived the comet. So who's really more fit? It depends on the environment, and we are all at the same advancement of evolution in terms of time. All human races have been evolving for exactly the same amount of time since they split from one another. And there's no evidence that certain races are any more advanced in total or in their individuals than others.
Okay, thank you, Snake. TRock, floor is yours.
So yeah, red paint spray. Excellent question. It really does bring out the heart of this debate in the last piece of that. If so, does that mean some races are less advanced genetically than others? I'm going to ignore the strictly genetic implications of that. I think those are self-evident. Mutation rates and total accumulation is different from one individual to the next and from one group to the next. So I think it goes without saying that by definition, yes, some are more or less evolved than others. But the real crux of this question points to the fact that evolutionists have had to clean up their language a lot because they've realized the damage it has done in the past. And the rabbit trails that it's sent people down are very damaging to society. So they've had to really clean up their language, backing up in time, getting closer to, Pol Pot and Hitler and Stalin and all them, and even closer to Darwin as you go back in time. Absolutely, they believed that some races were more or less evolved and therefore more or less necessary or beneficial to society. So yeah, the very fact that evolution has had to clean up its language so much and get rid of phrases like survival of the fittest and exactly what is evolutionary advancement mean in terms of humans, it pretty much defines and determines that yes, the teaching of evolution is obviously evil, or they wouldn't be cleaning up the language in it.
So that's a misunderstanding of evolution. It's not about cleaning up language. There are no human races that are more or less evolved than others. That is the evolutionary principle. You can't say that just because there's a branch off of a population that original population stopped evolving. That is a misunderstanding of the very concept that we're talking about. And that has nothing to do with cleaning up language. That is how evolution works. Darwin understood that just because a branch branched off does not mean that the old population stopped evolving and stopped having other branches come off of it. So no. And lots of horrible people have prejudices, and then they go and try and find things in science to justify these prejudices. You can't blame the science. You can't blame the science the terminology is associated with the bigots misusing and manipulating terminology for their own separate bigotry or means, whatever you want to call it. Like there was I forget the celebrity, so I won't say say a name, but he was saying that because white people lack melanin, that means that they are a lesser being. So that is scientifically true, that white people have less melanin in their skin. Does that mean that biology then justifies his racism? No. So that's just again, that's just, it's the same as a flat earther trying to misuse science.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Next question comes in from Cool Jesus. This one is for you, TRock. So Cool Jesus asks, if young Earth creation is true, then post-fall animals adapted to become carnivores. Does he believe that all natural selection and adaptation within kinds is evil also? Go ahead, TRock.
I mean, the short, easy answer is no. Post-fall animals adapted to become carnivores. Now that becoming carnivores is evil, because the two very important points in biblical Christianity: number one, all of the animals were created as vegetarian, not carnivores. They were explicitly given plants to eat. So that part is evil. The other reason it's evil is because the ultimate plan in biblical Christianity is to restore the earth to a time whenever carnivory basically goes away, and the lion lays down with the lamb, the child plays beside the cockatrice den, and so on and so forth. He says there will be no more harm in all my holy mountain. So the carnivory goes away in biblical Christianity because it is evil. Does he believe that all natural selection adaptation? I don't want to go into the long diatribe about natural selection, but adaptation was going to happen regardless of the fall. Adaptation has nothing to do with good or evil in general, in a very general sense. Now, obviously, I have to make an exception for carnivory, but adaptation is a little broader, so you have to distinguish between the two. An animal can adapt to a cold climate, a warm climate, a wet climate, a dry climate, whatever. That's not biblically described as evil or good. It's what they're designed to do so that they can survive. Natural selection is a completely different thing. I personally have probably different views than what others do. I don't think natural selection plays near the role in speciation as what most people do, and arguably even other creationists. So it's kind of hard to talk about that one in any great detail. To me, natural selection can just as easily be an animal getting up and moving because they're not well suited to their particular environment, and so they're selecting themselves to go find a different environment. I would categorize that as a type of natural selection. So I can't say all natural selection is evil, because there are subsets of it that are decidedly not evil.
All right, thank you for the answer to definitely a good question. So Taylor, over to you if there's anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think there's a problem of evil with God creating and tolerating evil, creating a universe and a form of life that he knows will eventually turn to evil, designing them that way. That's an unsolved problem in philosophy of religion, but that's another discussion. So I'll keep it brief.
Appreciate it. TRock, you can have a quick final word if you'd like to. Is your question?
Just to say that that was another exhibition of moral relativism being used to decide whether acts described in the Bible are morally right or wrong. You have no foundation to determine that in the first place. But it's also, once again, a very generalized description of what happened, and it's actually factually incorrect to some degree. But it's kind of highlighted by the fact that, let's say you go and build yourself a hot rod, or maybe a better example, you build a house and you move into your house. Do you get to decide who comes in and out of your house? Do you get to decide the rules of your house? Essentially what you're saying is, if God's the creator, he still doesn't have the right to decide the rules. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, gentlemen, thank you for those responses. Next question comes in from Dustin Buck. Dustin, thank you for the question. So, question for Snake was right. Can you show through your proof, such as the fossil record, a more morally evolved from a savage and immorally reprehensible creature?
I'm not quite sure what that means.
Uh,
I'm assuming he's asking, can I show humans evolved from a more savage state?
Can you show through your
or-
proof, such as the fossil record, a more morally evolved form from a savage to a morally? It's a little confusing to me too. He does have another question here. You know what, Dustin? Instead of us guessing what you mean by that, feel free to reiterate your question in a more understandable way. So here's his other question. For Snake was right. Can you show the/that morality is an advantage or a mechanism for natural selection, or that it is an independent variable?
That mortality, I guess that's morality, is an advantage. Yes. So if you can look at it in humans or even in any animal. Animals that care for each other and show empathy and compassion have an advantage over if those animals were left alone. There are animals that are adapted to be solitary animals, but like coyotes versus wolves. Wolves remain in packs, and that's an advantage for their lifestyle. Again, it all depends on the environment. As for humans, it's just cooperation in an evolutionary sense. Morality, as I've described it, cooperation, coexistence, not destroying each other. That brings up the whole society. More technology, more people working together. That's brought us medical technology, farming, irrigation, clean water. This has essentially been what allows us to take over the world. Yeah, partially a lot of that is industry and people going for profits. That's a good thing. I would say that that's a moral thing because I'm a capitalist. But a lot of that is based on trying to help each other too. And I would say that that's moral.
Okay, thank you for the answer there, Taylor. TRock, floor is yours.
So I think the question does highlight a really important point here, and that is the fact that evolution it can't even describe where morals come from. All they can say is, okay, apparently chemicals evolved to react or not react or make decisions or whatever. But the question highlights that evolution has no moral foundation whatsoever. So can you show that? Can an evolution show that morality is an advantage? No, but of course they can't, because they don't even know what it is or where it came from. But it also highlights the fact that what I've already said, evolution has had to clean up its language a lot. It's an advantage. For example, the lion eats the zebra. It's an advantage to the lion because he gets something to eat. It's not an advantage for the zebra because he gets eaten. And so it's back to that survival of the fittest thing and how evolution has had to clean up its language. Now Taylor made the comment earlier that it's not about cleaning up the language. It's about this, that, about he went on to talk about the misuse. But again, that is the root of the problem. How do you know whether you're misusing it or not? You have no way of determining that.
Yeah, we do know how things are misused. If you misuse terms like buoyancy and density, you're a flat earther.
Can I ask you a quick question, just real quick?
Okay.
And then you can continue and have the last word. How do you know it's wrong to misuse something? How do you know misuse is wrong, right or wrong in and of itself?
Are you saying morally wrong or like incorrect, like factually incorrect?
Morally.
Okay, so how would I say it's morally wrong to
To
be
misuse any idea.
okay? So because when you misuse certain ideas, you're going in. So using a like a car for an example, if you put the wrong parts in the engine's going to blow up, and your car's going to crash. If you use the wrong uh, morals or concepts in society, the society will crash. That's why socialist societies crash and burn, and millions starve, and people resort to tyranny because these ideas don't work. When you use false scientific ideas like Lysenkoism, again in communist Russia, the crops fail and people starve. And so, going with your definition, our definition of immorality as being destructive and lowering the amount of existence, that is an objective standard right there. Um, does that satisfy you?
Well, I said I would give you the last word, so I'm going to
Okay.
leave it.
So trying to remember some of the stuff you said. So your God created this problem of predator and prey, if what you say is true. So I'm not sure how that point helps you out. But evolution can absolutely show us where moral intuitions come from. It doesn't. Nothing about evolution tells us like what I just described about morality, about logical contradictions or what good and bad is. Evolution can show us what's good and bad for survival, which is part of the equation, but not part of the overall objective universal good and bad. Um, but evolution can show why certain populations survive better with certain moral intuitions. If humans care about each other, they're going to kill each other less, destroy each other less, and survive more. And there is a bit of a crossover because obviously if these tenets are true, that cooperation is a good thing, it will emerge in the natural world. But evolution is not, you can't derive moral oughts from evolution. It's just a descriptive where what populations of life does. Um, but there is some crossover.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Next question comes in from Redefine Living. I'll get maybe one or two more questions. I want to wrap this up at the 2.5 hour mark, gentlemen. So time has flown by, and again, fantastic debate. So Sam asks, question for Snake. Snake is arguing from a presupposition that people judged in the Bible were innocent. How can he show they were innocent? Go ahead.
Yeah, so little babies and little children, those were definitely innocent people. This is how having a religion turns you into a moral monster. This is one of the worst things you could possibly say, Redefine Living. And basically, shame on you. But no, I do not have a presupposition that they're judged in. You have a presupposition that they were guilty. I don't have a presupposition either way. You have to show that they're guilty. Um, there's nothing a baby can do that can make it guilty, so I think that I'm pretty safe in making that deduction, not a presupposition. Same with children, and yeah, no presuppositions here.
Okay, thank you, Taylor. TRock, over to you if there's anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, another good question, because it kind of puts the focus on the opposite of evil, which is good. So again, because evolution has no moral foundation, it can't know whether somebody's innocent or evil or guilty. It can't know that because that's a moral implication. So again, this is just another example of how moral relativism is trying to accuse an internally consistent. There's a law that says whether or not they're innocent or guilty. And that's what determines whether somebody's allowed to kill or not kill. But how does evolution evaluate that? How does evolutionary thinking in any way evaluate that? The only way it can is with its relativistic way of thinking. So if you don't like Taylor's basic sense of morality, or if you don't like the current popular sense of morality in any given part of the country that's basically a following of evolution, stick around. It'll change. Whatever they think is moral today, tomorrow somebody else will have a completely different judgment on that same thing. And that, again, highlights moral relativism for both innocent and guilty.
Thank you, TRock.
Yeah.
Taylor, you get the last word. Question was for you.
Yeah, being born to Amalekites does not make you guilty of anything. This is how epistemology works. We don't assume something is true until it's proven. So in terms of guilt, this is how our justice system works. We don't assume someone is guilty until they're proven guilty. You're just assuming and claiming that they're guilty because God says they're guilty, so you know that they're guilty because God says they're guilty, which is circular reasoning, which is fallacious, which means we can't use it, which means you're left with nothing, and I'm left with the principles that founded our nation. I'm left with logic. I'm left consistent. You're left defending genocide and murder and slavery.
All right. Thank you. And final question for the night. The audience Q&A has flown by as well. Again, this debate topic is important. It's a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to more debates on this exact topic in the future. So to the audience, thank you so much for sending in your questions for the debaters. Cool Jesus asked a question for you, TRock. So he asks, if God intervenes in the world today, doesn't that mean God contradicts himself by intervening on himself?
It depends on what you mean by intervenes. In short, no, it does not mean that. The way the question is posed, it absolutely does not mean that. Nowhere in the law or the in the written word of God does he say that he can't intervene on his own creation. He never. If he said that, then that would be true, but he never said that. So what do you mean by intervene? God cannot break his own laws. The Bible says that it describes him as in whom there is no variableness nor shadow of turning. So that means he cannot break his own laws. So whatever you mean by intervene, it can't mean that he's going to break one of his own laws. But he does absolutely reserve the right to intervene on his own creation, because he never said he wouldn't. Actually, he said he will.
All right. Thank you, TRock. Snake, over to you.
I think this is a great point because God contradicts himself and changes his mind constantly in the Bible. He changes what the 10 Commandments are. He changes his mind with even the passages we were writing. He said he wanted to destroy them, but Moses argued him out of it. Noah's flood, for some reason, whenever he decided to kill everyone, that was fine to do, but then he decided never again, even though there are even more cities with even more supposed immoral things that were going on in Sodom and Gomorrah, in the cities that he wanted to destroy. There's a whole lot of that still going on today, but for some reason, he's never going to do that again. The fall in the garden, he has the garden. He sets it up for Adam and Eve to fail, and suddenly is surprised to find that they've disobeyed him. So this contradicts both his omniscience, all of these examples contradicts his omniscience and the standards he set up. And something that TRock brought up before, apparently God's invariable, but he has different standards for different people at different times. He has New Testament laws which are changed by the Old Testament laws which are changed by the New Testament laws. So he constantly has this changing double standard, not to mention the self-contradictory as essential self-contradictoriness of might makes right, allowing slavery, commanding genocide, divine command. That's all. None of that is consistent at all.
All right. And TRock, question was for you. We'll give you the last word.
So Taylor's entire response once again highlighted the use of moral relativism to decide whether somebody else's position is right or wrong. But The problem, of course, is recursive, because in moral relativism, you can't say with any authority, because you have no authority, you have no foundation to declare it to be so. You can't say whether it's wrong to contradict yourself or not. You can't say whether it's wrong to misuse or something or not. You can't say whether it's wrong to live or die. In the naturalistic worldview, the entire universe is supposed to eventually undergo heat death. Everybody's going to die. All the stars are going to explode or go cold, and all of the life on all of the planets that supposedly exist, especially the Earth, it's all going to die. Everything's going away, and so it only has one. Ending to its story. But again, this kind of highlights the problem that it's a what's the word I'm looking for? There's you're just perpetuating the problem with your decision making. You don't know. You can't declare whether it's right or wrong to contradict yourself.
So, so since you asked me a question during one of my responses, could I ask one of you?
Sure, go ahead.
So are you saying that it is not objectively incorrect? A contradiction is not an objective incorrectness?
No, that's not what I'm saying. Actually, the laws of logic say that, and I talk about this quite frequently, internal consistency. Now, you made a bunch of claims that there was a contradiction, but you're using your own moral viewpoint to determine whether that's right or wrong. That's the point. The contradictions you suppose are there are not actually there. I'm just bypassing that, because the bigger problem with your argument is that you're trying to say that it's wrong to contradict yourself. But why in a position that has no moral, absolute moral foundation? How do you know anything is right or wrong, self-contradictory or otherwise?
All right, gentlemen. Again, TRock, Taylor, thank you for another great debate, another one in the books here. And before we shut it down, though, I do want to give you both the opportunity for some final words, final thoughts. I do thank you both for giving us your time for this important debate. Taylor, why don't we start with you? Final words, final thoughts. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming. Maybe we can set up a further discussion on moral foundations, because it is an interesting question. Why is contradicting yourself wrong? Yeah, check out Snake Was Right and Debate Cafe. Maybe we could have you on there sometime. And yep, thank you guys.
All right. Thank you for those closing words. Snake Was Right YouTube channel and Debate Cafe. And I believe we are also in the works on setting up Taylor versus Professor McQueen on relatively the same topic. So more to come on Is Evolution Evil? TRock, thank you for doing this. Thank you for being here. Final words, final thoughts.
Yeah, no, it was. I think it's another good discussion to have. We need to expose exactly why evolution is evil. I think the conversation brought that out fairly well. Anyway, debate's over. Thank you guys very much for participating. Thank you, Taylor, for a civil discussion. Yes, I would absolutely entertain continuing the discussion. If we need to narrow down, some of the subject matter, that'd be great.
Absolutely. I'd love it. A round 3 between TRock and Snake Was Right, just to complete the trilogy.
God bless.